I'll call to order the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology and welcome everyone here for our first hearing of 2016. And thank our distinguished panelists for being here to share your views on these bills with us today. And I want to welcome my colleagues back as we get underway in what should be another very busy and hopefully productive year for the Subcommittee on Communications and Technology. I'd like to thank you all for the great work we've done, not only last year, but over the last few years that have produced bipartisan legislation that's become law. And actually, as you look to, I think today's the deadline for broadcasters to decide if they're going to participate in the auction. Another big auction could be underway, first of its kind, that could produce more revenue for the taxpayers and more wireless broadband for the people. So pretty exciting times in which we live, and we'll be continuing to do oversight on the auction and the issues associated with it. We'll continue to do oversight on FirstNet and those issues as we go forward, and other issues that members have brought to our attention. So look forward to another big and productive year for our subcommittee, and I thank the great participation that we get. Now on to today's hearing. We will hear from the four bills, each designed to improve the legal and regulatory environment for consumers and small businesses. First, the subcommittee will consider H.R. 2669. This is the Anti-Spoofing Act of 2015, introduced by Representatives Meng, Barton, and Lance. It is a reintroduction of legislation that came out of this subcommittee last Congress. H.R. 2669 would extend the provisions of the Truth in Called ID Act to text messaging and VoIP services. This legislation passed the House unanimously last Congress. I expect it'll enjoy a similar level of support in this Congress. Second, we will examine H.R. 1301. This is the Amateur Radio Parity Act of 2015. As a ham radio operator, and perhaps one of the only in Congress, I'm acutely aware of the passion that amateur radio operators have for their service. Despite its widespread use and importance in times of emergency, some land use restrictions in some areas have prioritized aesthetics over the rights of hams. H.R. 1301 seeks to ensure that amateur radio operators get a fair shake and protection from unnecessary bans on their equipment by instructing the FCC to adopt rules to this end. Now, I know some have said this is opening the door to 40-foot towers in townhome backyards. That's not the case. Ham equipment can be as small as over-the-air digital television antenna that are becoming popular with cord cutters. Surely ham radio operators' communications deserve no less protection than access to primetime television. This is a common sense bill, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Finally, we'll consider two bills that concur with FCC's own policy. H.R. 2666, Representative Kinzinger's No-Rate Regulation of Broadband Internet Access Act, seeks to codify the assurances of FCC Chairman Tom Wheeler by prohibiting the FCC from using its new authority under the Open Internet Order to regulate rates charged for broadband. Simply put, this is what President Obama and Chairman Wheeler have stated publicly, time and again, but put in statutory form. President Obama, in his now infamous YouTube directive to the FCC, directed the FCC to reclassify broadband under Title II, quote, while forbearing from rate regulation, close quote. In front of multiple congressional committees in both the House and the Senate, Chairman Wheeler has continually repeated what he stated succinctly in his statement when the FCC adopted the Open Internet Order that, quote, that means no rate regulation, no filing of tariffs, and no network unbundling, close quote. H.R. 2666 simply does what President Obama and Chairman Wheeler cannot. It binds future chairmen to live by the commitments that this administration has made as to how the sweeping authority the FCC granted itself is to be used. Some have been critical of this bill, seeking to change the language to preclude the use of tariff authority, an authority the FCC has already forborne from using, while leaving the Commission and its Enforcement Bureau free to use enforcement authority to regulate rates. Rate regulation, by after-the-fact second-guessing, is rate regulation nonetheless. We should ensure that the specter of rate regulation of broadband is off the table permanently. In addition to Mr. Kinzinger's rate regulation bill, we will also examine a discussion draft of a bill that I'm offering to make permanent the exception to the Commission's enhanced transparency rule for small businesses. In the Open Internet Order, the Commission rightly recognized that the work required by the enhanced transparency rule would be an undue burden on small businesses, and it provided a temporary exception from the rule. Just last month, the FCC extended that exception through the end of 2016. While I'm sure that small businesses are appreciative of the reprieve from the costs of compliance with this rule, the reprieve is not a pardon. Small businesses deserve the certainty of a permanent exception from this unnecessary burden. Additionally, this draft would also harmonize the FCC's definition of small ISP with the harmonize the definition of small ISP with the definition used by the U.S. Small Business Administration. It makes no sense to subject businesses to different definitions of small across different agencies, and deference to the SBA definition ensures that the part of the federal government charged with small business issues range. These four bills will ensure that consumers and small businesses are protected from unnecessary burdens and misuse of authorities granted in law, and I look forward to advancing these bills to the House floor as soon as possible. I thank our witnesses for being here to discuss the diverse sets of bills and look forward to their counsel. I ask unanimous consent now to enter into the record a letter from Mr. Chris Imlay, General Counsel of the Amateur Radio Relay League, expressing support for the Amateur Radio Parity Act, as well as a letter from Mr. Thomas Skiba, CEO of the Community Associations Institute, suggesting changes to the legislation from the perspective of homeowners and community associations. Without objection. I also want to thank both the ARRL and CAI for their comments on this legislation, and we look forward to working with them and with the ranking member as we advance this important legislation. I'd also like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from FCC Commissioners Pai and O'Reilly expressing concern with the impact of the enhanced transparency rule on small businesses and questioning the veracity of the FCC's Paperwork Reduction Act analysis. Without objection. I yield back the balance of my time. I thank the committee's indulgence, and I recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Eshoo, for opening comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Happy New Year to everyone. And thank you to the witnesses. It's wonderful to see you. And I want to associate myself with what the chairman said about looking forward to this year. We have a lot on our plate. There are exciting things that are taking place. And I think that the full engagement of this subcommittee, not only in oversight, but legislative ideas that come up, that we will make optimum use of this year. It's always said that the presidential election year, nothing happens, but I don't think that tagline is going to apply to our subcommittee. So I, too, look forward to working with you and with all of the members on both sides of the aisle to uphold the doing of this committee, the work that the committee does. So today is our first subcommittee meeting of the year, and we have some important bills in front of us. I think it's a mixture of good and perhaps not so good bills, but I think that with the key witnesses that we have here today, I'll raise my questions with them. First up is H.R. 2666, the No Rate Regulation of Broadband Internet Access Act. I agree, Mr. Chairman, about no rate regulation. So you can put my name down next to the President, to the FCC Chairman, and Anna Eshoo. I'm not for the FCC regulating the monthly recurring rate that consumers pay for broadband internet access service. Now, consistent with this view, last year, as we all know, Chairman Wheeler adopted what some of us call a modern light touch approach that forgoes the unnecessary provisions of Title II, such as rate regulation, tariffing, and cost accounting rules. At the same time, the Commission has an important role to play, and this is what I want to highlight on this issue, in consumer protection, which includes the billing practices of the nation's broadband providers. You'll recall that I raised the issue over and over again of below-the-line fees, and I think that in our discussions with with the witnesses, it's something that we really should kind of pull apart and examine to make sure that there aren't any unintended consequences of the legislation for consumers. And I think that I think it's an area that we can come to an agreement on. Because it includes discriminatory data caps or some future practice that we don't even foresee right now. So I think it's an area that we need to take a good look at. Secondly, the subcommittee is considering the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act. Now, this is proposed so that small businesses will not be burdened, small broadband providers. And I think that that's very important. The bill exempts companies with hundreds of millions in annual revenue from complying with the enhanced transparency requirements included in the FCC's 2015 Open Internet Order. Now, this includes disclosure of promotional rates, fees, charges, and data caps, but it would leave millions of consumers, particularly those in rural areas, with fewer protections than those in big cities. I think that we can reach some common ground on this, and I want to work with everyone on this, but I don't think that rural areas that are particularly hard hit, when you see the report that came out of the FCC, rural areas are really lagging behind in our country with broadband. Third, while I've been a long-time supporter of amateur radio operators, including you, Mr. Chairman, and the services that they provide, and I have a lot in my district, I do have some concerns with the Amateur Radio Parity Act. As written, the legislation could violate the rights of homeowners associations, and that's who I've heard from. So I think, again, we've got to take a look at this and make sure that we can blend the underlying purpose of this and not stick it to the homeowners associations, the HOAs in the country, by overruling covenants and easements that are conveyed with the purchase of a property from one seller to another. And I'm proud to be a co-sponsor of Congresswoman Grace Meng's legislation, the Anti-Spoofing Act. It's a bipartisan bill. It's a good bill. I think there are, nearly 20 members of the subcommittee that are co-sponsors of it, and it deserves to move forward the way it did before. So, again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for convening this hearing. Look forward to this year, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady for
yield back, though. Thank you
comments,
for your
and we
patience.
We look forward to working together on these and other issues this year. We'll turn now to the Vice Chair of the full committee, the gentlelady from Tennessee, Ms. Blackburn. Morning. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to say welcome to our witnesses. We are pleased that you are here, and I'm appreciative of the 4 bills that we're going to discuss this morning. I want to touch on 2 of these. First, the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act, protecting these small ISPs who really don't have the resources to comply with net neutrality's enhanced disclosure requirements. This is important for us. The small ISPs and serving their footprint are many times the way we can increase that access to affordable broadband. So we're going to be anxious to talk about that and to get your insights on that. Secondly, H.R. 2666, which codifies Chairman Wheeler's pledge that he made and President Obama's pledge likewise to not engage in rate regulation. This is something that is important to us to do. I thought it was so interesting last March in Barcelona at the Mobile World Congress. Chairman Wheeler said, "This is not regulating the Internet. Regulating the Internet is rate regulation, which we don't do," ending the quote. We want to make certain that he is good to that promise. Rate regulation is something that causes us tremendous concern. I appreciate Congressman Kinzinger bringing the legislation forward and look forward to a full discussion of that proposal with you all. And at this time, I yield the balance of the time to Mr. Latta.
Well, I appreciate the gentlelady for yielding, and also thank the chairman for holding today's hearing, and I'd also like to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Greatly appreciate it. All four bills before us today are good legislative measures that will limit unnecessary government regulations and protect consumers. I'd like to focus my time on the two bills that stem from the FCC's decision to reclassify broadband as a telecommunications service under Title II of the Communications Act. First, as a result of Title II, the FCC extended its authority to regulate rates charged for broadband. The threat of rate regulation would chill network investments and stifle innovation. H.R. 2666, of which I am a co-sponsor, would prohibit the Commission from regulating rates and remove regulatory uncertainty for Internet service providers. Secondly, Small Business Broadband Deployment Act would help eliminate a burdensome regulation created by Title II by making permanent the temporary exemption for small ISPs from enhanced transparency requirements. Providers in my district have made it clear to me that this exemption is vital for their continued operation. Look forward to today's hearing, and I appreciate the gentlelady yielding. I yield back.
Yield back.
Gentlelady yields back, and now we'll turn to the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and our ranking member, Ms. Eshoo, for holding this hearing. And let me also thank our witnesses for being here. I know you're not strangers to this subcommittee, and I appreciate your willingness to come up to testify. I also appreciate the commitment that Chairman Walden is showing to regular order. Legislative hearings like this one we're holding today do not simply check a box. They help our members and the public better understand the potential effects of the bills before us. When the committee is given opportunities to make reasonable and thoughtful decisions, we end up with better results. I'm particularly interested in learning more today about the bill prohibiting the FCC from regulating rates for broadband Internet access. I agree with the sentiment driving this bill. The Commission should not be setting rates for broadband access. In fact, we've heard from FCC Chairman Wheeler himself that he does not intend to set rates. Nonetheless, I've also heard concerns that as drafted, this bill may result in significant unintended consequences. For instance, some believe that it could spur endless litigation, leading to uncertainty in the market and deterring investment. Worse, the bill could seriously curtail the FCC's ability to protect consumers. Obviously, that result is not acceptable. Today's hearing gives us the chance to learn more about these potential consequences and whether the bill can be better targeted to avoid these pitfalls. I also look forward to hearing more about the other three bills on today's agenda: amateur radio, transparency into service provider practices, and prevention of fraudulent caller ID are all important topics worthy of a fair hearing. But while today's hearing marks a good start for the year, I hope that this is only the first legislative hearing we hold. I further hope that future hearings include ideas put forward by Democratic members such as Congressman Welch's Digital Learning Equity Act, Congresswoman Matsui's Spectrum Challenge Prize Act, Congressman Lujan's FCC Transparency Act, and even my own Viewer Protection Act, or SANDY Act. All of these bills address pressing issues the American people care about, and they deserve the opportunity to be heard. So with that, I look forward to the rest of the discussion, and I yield the balance of my time to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Matsui.
I thank the ranking member for yielding me time. Two of the bills on our agenda address the FCC's net neutrality order. Like millions of Americans who made their voices heard last year, I support a free and open Internet. At the same time, I do not believe the FCC needs to get into the business of regulating consumer broadband rates. Chairman Wheeler has also stated many times that he is not interested in rate regulation either. What I'm concerned about is the potential for paid prioritization schemes to create fast and slow lanes on the Internet. And that is why I introduced a bill with Senator Leahy to instruct the FCC to write rules to ban paid prioritization. And I was pleased that the FCC included a ban on paid prioritization in the net neutrality rules. I am concerned that the two net neutrality bills we are considering today could undermine important consumer protections like the paid prioritization rule. I do look forward to hearing from today's witnesses about all four bills under consideration today. I thank the witnesses for being here today, and I yield back to the ranking member to give time to anybody else he so feels. Thank you.
all times been consumed and yielded back, and we appreciate the comments of all of our members. We'll now go to our witnesses and thank them for being here. The Honorable Robert McDowell, partner Wiley Rain LLP and senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. We thank you for being here. Mr. Harold Feld, senior vice president, public knowledge. Good to have you back before our committee as well. And Ms. Elizabeth Bowles, President and Chair of the Board of Aristotle, Inc., on behalf of the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association. Ms. Bowles, we appreciate your being here to testify, too. So I think we'll start with Mr. McDowell. We've always enjoyed having you before the committee, and we're glad to have you back this time. So welcome to, as the first witness in the new year before our subcommittee. Don't blow it, okay?
No pressure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Happy New Year to all distinguished members of the committee and the ranking member Eshoo as well. It is an honor to be here again and to be your first witness of 2016. And by the way, although I am a partner at Wiley Ryan and a senior fellow of the Hudson Institute, the opinions I expressed today are strictly my own. Congress has a terrific opportunity to pass the legislation before this subcommittee today on a bipartisan basis. Specifically, and in the observance of time, I'll refer to just two bills, and we can talk about the other two bills later. One being the No-Rate Regulation of Broadband Internet Access Act and the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act. As has been pointed out, both President Obama and FCC Chairman Wheeler have expressed their opposition to rate regulation of broadband services. Although in 2014 the President called on the FCC to classify broadband services under Title II before it did so last year, he also asked that it forbear from rate regulation. Similarly, Chairman Wheeler stated last May that broadband providers should be, quote, free from any limiting rate regulation, end quote. He also testified before the Senate Appropriations Committee that, quote, if Congress wants to come along and say that's, meaning rate regulation, is off the table for the next commission, I have no difficulty with it, end quote. These sentiments also echo the policies of the Clinton-Gore White House and the Clinton-era FCC under then-Chairman Bill Kennard. They, as well as the Federal Trade Commission on a unanimous bipartisan vote in 2007, and the Obama Department of Justice, have all warned against regulating the rates of broadband networks. Why? Because they and scores of independent market analysts, entrepreneurs, economists, and think tanks agree that rate regulation deters investment and constructive entrepreneurial risk-taking, stifles innovation, and would slow the evolution of the lightning-fast internet. And we appear to have a bipartisan consensus here today on rate regulation. In short, H.R. 2666 merely codifies what Democrats and Republicans have been seeking, essentially for decades, a ban on rate regulation of internet services. The bill could benefit, however, from clarifying at least two ambiguities. The first would be to make it clear that it prohibits all rate regulation, including ex post or after the fact determinations that rates are unjust or unreasonable. As written, it applies only to ex ante or before the fact regulation. The second would be to clarify which rates it addresses. Currently, with the Open Internet Order, the FCC attempted to give itself the authority to rate regulate all Internet access services, including interconnection and peering. It is the bipartisan consensus, it appears, that these services should not be rate regulated. This bill simply offers to codify that bipartisan spirit and hold future FCCs to that promise through clear statutory language. Similarly, the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act would codify on a permanent basis what the FCC has attempted to do on a temporary basis, which is to exempt small ISPs from the order's transparency requirements. As the current regulatory regime now stands, the Commission will review the exemption on an annual basis, leaving small business owners in a perpetual state of limbo. There's a lot more to discuss. I do support the other two bills and look forward to a robust, in-depth discussion of amateur radio. In 7 years as an FCC commissioner, I think I spent maybe 10 minutes on amateur radio, but I think 5 of them are renewing your license, Mr. Chairman.
I'm glad you took a personal interest in it.
Yes. So I look forward to discussing it. Thank you again.
At least I didn't have to take the code test again. We'll now go to Mr. Feld, Public Knowledge. Good to have you back before the committee, Mr. Feld. Please go ahead with your comment.
Thank you, Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, for inviting me here to testify. I am pleased to support H.R. 2669, the Anti-Spoofing Act of 2016, and H.R. 1301, the Amateur Radio Parity Act. Both bills are carefully drafted and narrowly tailored to address clear and pressing problems. As a result, these bills may be seamlessly integrated into the Communications Act without unintended consequences. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the broadband bills under consideration. Let me start with H.R. 2666, the No Rate Regulation of Broadband Internet Access Service Act. As everyone agrees, there is no evidence that the FCC plans to start regulating broadband prices. Supporters support the bill from the fear that a future FCC may someday change the policy. Unfortunately, the broad sweeping language of H.R. 2666 virtually guarantees a host of unintended consequences that are bad for consumers and bad for competition. The bill prohibits any FCC action under any law to, quote, regulate the rates broadband providers charge for broadband access. This would appear to prevent FCC enforcement action of laws against deceptive billing practices, deliberate overcharges, or even outright fraud. Further, although the bill's supporters claim it leaves the core protections of the FCC's net neutrality rules alone, is it easy to argue that enforcing the rule against paid prioritization or prohibiting providers from favoring their own content and services either directly or indirectly regulates the rates charged for broadband internet access service. Finally, the bill's broad sweeping language will disrupt the FCC's ongoing efforts to reform the Universal Service Fund. The proposed bill's broad sweeping language would force the FCC to halt and perhaps discontinue the already complicated process of making broadband in rural America affordable, as affordable, of course, is a price regulation. Similarly, the proposed Small Business Broadband Deployment Act raises the specter of significant unintended consequences. Consider the impact on the millions of residential and small business subscribers the bill strips of the protections of transparency. This puts every family-owned business at risk from fly-by-night providers that the proposed legislation will render unaccountable for incomplete and dishonest disclosure. The proposed Small Business Broadband Deployment Bill will create an incentive for small business broadband subscribers to select national providers over local small providers so that their businesses can enjoy the full protection of the transparency rule. It would be ironic if, in the haste to protect small broadband providers from possible paperwork, the proposed bill accidentally drives away the very small business customers these small providers need to survive. Finally, the bill expands the size of the current FCC exemption to providers with up to 1,500 employees or 500,000 subscribers. These providers, which most of us would consider mid-sized providers rather than small providers, are already subject to the FCC's transparency rules. Nothing since the rules went into effect shows that these larger firms need relief. Nevertheless, the bill strips millions of consumers and small business subscribers of valuable protections they currently enjoy. Bluntly, before Congress strips millions of people of important protections against fraud and abuse, it should have clear evidence of a real need and should narrowly tailor the language to address that need. At the very least, making the small business exemption to the Commission's enhanced transparency rules is premature. The FCC has not yet finished its paperwork reduction analysis or adopted a final rule. At a minimum, Congress should wait for the FCC to assess the burden estimates submitted by stakeholders and see whether the FCC adopts stakeholder suggestions, such as those made by the ACA, to minimize the estimated burden. Let me conclude with this analogy. We have all experienced the frustration of downloading an update to our phone or laptop and discovering that a poorly written line of code has created a new security breach or caused key applications to crash. The same, unfortunately, can happen with the Communications Act. Rushing to pass bills with broad, sweeping language to address vaguely defined hypothetical problems will create bugs in our legal code that bad actors can exploit and will crash FCC efforts to bring affordable broadband to all Americans. Congress should not release this legal software update until it has been thoroughly debugged and checked for compatibility with the existing operating system. Thank you, and I am happy to answer any further questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Feld. We'll now go to Ms. Bowles. Thank you for being here. We look forward to your testimony as well.
Thank you for having me. Chairman Walden, Ranking Member Eshoo, members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to limit my remarks in the interest of time to the H.R. 2666 and the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act. WSBA represents the interests of more than 800 providers all over the United States, and my company, Aristotle, provides broadband service to approximately 800 residential and business subscribers in central Arkansas, including small, underserved, rural Arkansas communities such as Sardis, Valonia, and Shannon Hills. Our members use unlicensed spectrum primarily to provide broadband to underserved areas that are not cost-effective for traditional wireline companies to serve. And they operate in diverse communities like Scott, Arkansas, Stony Bridge, Ohio, and La Grande, Oregon, all of which are very small towns. Scott, for example, has 72 people. There are hundreds of other places where service from a WISP may be the only terrestrial means to access the internet, and the vast majority of our members have built their networks without the benefit of federal subsidies. Under any definition, nearly all of WISPA's members, including my company, are small businesses. Some WISPs have only a handful of employees who do everything from climbing the towers to doing the accounting to customer service. According to the FCC, 17 broadband access providers serve 93% of the population. The remaining 7%, 21 million people, is served by the over 3,000 broadband internet access providers that are considered small ISPs. As Congresswoman Eshoo said, what's going on in rural America is critical. We have to get broadband into rural America, and the 3,000 small ISPs are bringing that service to those people. WISPA believes in an open internet and in the effectiveness of the 2010 light touch regulatory regime. My company has never throttled, never capped usage, nor required anyone to pay to prioritize traffic. The FCC's reclassification of broadband as a Title II service was misguided, and WISPA is concerned about the effects that the 2015 order will have on small businesses. My company is already feeling the impact of the FCC's rules. Because of the risks and costs imposed by the order, Aristotle has reassessed its plan to expand its service, pending clarification of the regulatory regime. Instead of expanding our network to cover a 3-county area, we're now deploying in 3 smaller communities. We cannot justify a greater investment in light of regulatory uncertainty. Small businesses, those with providers of 100,000 or fewer, are temporarily exempt from the new enhanced disclosure requirements, but the uncertainty still exists. The FCC's decisions may have provided short-term relief, but the agency failed on 2 occasions to make the exemption permanent, despite an overwhelming record supporting that move. First of all, the FCC received not a single comment alleging that small ISPs were flaunting the 2010 disclosure rules or that those rules were insufficient to protect consumers. In fact, the record showed that consumers, including rural consumers, would bear the cost burden as small businesses are forced to pass on additional regulatory compliance costs. The FCC failed to consider adequately the cost that will be imposed on consumers, which in turn led to the flawed decision to impose a one-size-fits-all regulatory regime that penalizes small business. Second, the FCC failed to analyze properly the impact on small businesses required by the Paperwork Reduction Act. It estimated, with no supporting facts, that the burden on small business would be less than that on larger businesses. That conclusion failed to grasp that small ISPs do not have in-house lawyers to review and understand the new disclosure rules, do not have the administrative staff to maintain the ongoing compliance, or the means to measure packet loss. Every dollar a small business spends on unnecessary regulatory compliance is a dollar not being spent on new hires, network upgrades, and expansion. Third, the record in the follow-on proceeding overwhelmingly supported a permanent exemption. Not a single one of the millions of consumers who wrote into the FCC in the months before open internet was adopted wrote to oppose a permanent exemption. The FCC has had 2 opportunities to get it right, and we would not be here today if the FCC had followed the clear record. But they didn't, and now small ISPs face the prospect of more FCC proceedings and continuing uncertainty. As I sit here today, WISPA members have been declined funding. One of our members in Oregon was told by his bank that he would not be funded because they were uncertain about the regulatory regime. Other WISPA members have changed their business plans, cut back or redirected investment funding in order to hire regulatory counsel. The reality is clear. Imposing excessive and unnecessary burdens on small ISPs has dampened the very investment that has made broadband service to rural America possible. And as for rate regulation in H.R. 2666, WISPA supports any legislation that would prevent the FCC from regulating the rates we charge our subscribers. Thank you.
Ms. Bowles, thank you for your testimony. And to all of our witnesses, thank you. I'd like to go back to you and start off the questioning. Having been a small business owner with my wife for 20 years in the broadcast business, we're out of it now for quite a while. I know what it was like to deal with government regulations and all of this. Can you tell us, what does it really mean to you if you had to comply with these new transparency rules? Fundamentally, what does that mean? What would you have to start monitoring and doing and reporting, and the kind of staff levels that would take and what it takes away from expanding your service?
Well, what it means specifically is we have to get our arms around what the regulations actually require us to do. And I don't have a grasp of that because my company has never been under Title II, and I don't know which of these provisions are locking and loading and which of them are not. So there has to be an analysis done over what applies and what doesn't apply.
Okay.
And there's a lot of conversation on the list from our members asking just those questions. What does this mean? What does it mean that I have to do a transparency statement? What does it mean that I need to be more open? What does it mean that I have to make my rates available? And they don't actually understand what the regulation is saying.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an expense. I need regulatory counsel to explain even what I'm doing. And then there's an ongoing regulatory compliance burden. And I didn't have a chance really to get into it, but in addition to that, there's the threat of litigation. Because if there's a problem in the net neutrality statement, or if there's a reason that a consumer feels that they're not being dealt with frankly, then there's a potential risk of litigation. So I need counsel to deal with that as well. I think one estimate, member got a quote for $40,000 is what it would cost them. That's the cost of deploying a tower. So I'm looking at choosing between deploying a tower into a rural community or hiring regulatory counsel.
All right. Mr. McDowell, in a letter to the committee yesterday, Commissioners Pai and O'Reilly expressed their concerns with the process by which the FCC decided to extend the exemption, focusing primarily on the lack of a cost-benefit analysis prior to adoption of the rules and the use of the Paperwork Reduction Act process as an excuse to delay a final decision. Could you how could a thorough cost-benefit analysis in this situation have benefited the final rules?
Well, it would glean facts and analyses that would help the Commission render a final decision. So actually the Commission sort of got the cart before the horse if it's going to adopt a rule and then do the analysis, rather than doing the analysis and then decide whether or not to adopt the rule. But it seems to be the intent of the Commission to at least have a temporary exemption, and if it's going to be a temporary exemption, why not make this a permanent exemption? Mm-hmm. So there appears to be enough evidence in the mind of the majority of the Commission that there is an undue burden on these smaller companies, such as WISPs and others. So why not make that the permanent public policy?
And by the way, the size of the exemption that we picked for the draft legislation or the proposal we're talking about here is actually the federal government's definition of a small business. It's the SBA that comes up with this size of provider. So if you're going to have a small business exemption, we ought to have one standard is the theory here, and the government already sets that standard. Does this kind of, I want to get to the rate regulation issue and the issue of post facto rate regulation. Does that, Mr. McDowell, limit innovation? I'm concerned that companies will be unwilling to create new products or engage in new services if they're uncertain as to how they'll be received by the agency after the fact. I'm concerned that inquiries like the Commission's recent request to the wireless providers for information on sponsored data plans will create a mother may I environment for innovation. Is that a legitimate concern?
It is. I mean, let's let history be our guide real quickly. You know, under the Carter administration, airlines were deregulated. Prior to that, trucking and railroads as well, from common carrier rate regulation. And what we found was the opposite of what all the critics of that said happened. So rates went down for consumers, quality went up, investment went up, transit time shrunk. So in other words, the consumer experience got better at a lower cost with more investment. So that tells us a couple of things. And similar, by the way, similar effect after the 1996 Telecom Act, which was partially deregulatory. And this has happened in Europe with railroads and telecoms and other contexts too. That tells us that rate regulation, by the way, keeps rates artificially high and inhibits constructive risk-taking and investment. And, you know, I kept on my desk at the FCC my grandmother's black rotary dial phone from San Angelo, Texas, to remind me of the innovation you get from Title II in general and rate regulation. And that was the state of the art for decades, the black rotary dial phone.
Yeah, indeed. All right, my time has expired. I thank our panelists again for your comments and your answers to our questions, and I'll turn to my friend from California, Ms. Eshoo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks again to the witnesses for your fine testimony. I want to go to Ms. Bowles first. It's my understanding that there is a you spoke of essentially time and cost of time and rural areas and the number of customers, and I don't know what's based in actual facts, though. It seemed as if, we're afraid of some big boogeyman out there, and we think that this might happen, and therefore we need a law. And laws are a big deal. They're a big deal. So some have told me that these revisions, they're estimated, to develop and draft and revise the disclosures would require an annual expenditure of 16 to 24 hours. You're talking about having to hire suites of lawyers. I don't know what other word to use. It sounds like an exaggeration to me. Now, burdens are burdens, and small businesses are small businesses. What's the largest outfit that you represent? How many employees do they have?
I actually don't know their number of employees. They have 200,000 subscribers.
200,000 subscribers.
And they are probably 10 times larger than the next largest WISP. Mm-hmm. And the average WISP is between 1,500 and 2,000 subscribers.
So the largest of who you represent has 200,000 subscribers?
Yes.
And nothing larger than that?
Not at this time, but they're continuing to grow.
Well, on this whole issue of what the burden would be if it's 16 to 24 hours, as has been reported to me, that's about 2.9 seconds a day per year. I mean, that doesn't seem... See, what I'm worried about, the end result on the customers, on the consumers. And, it's being said, well, they're going to call, they're going to want to know, they want to have a question answered. That's the life of a business. You don't have a business unless you have customers. Customers are always going to have questions. So I just want to make sure in this, and I'm not sure from your testimony that it really is clear, that the very customers that are consumers don't end up being screwed somehow, in plain English. I have every empathy and respect for small businesses. I'm the daughter of a small business owner. I worked in that business with my father. So, but I do think that there needs to be a balance. So I think we're going to have to get more information from you, because there seems to be an overstatement, in my view, of the case. And if the largest number of those served is 200,000, I don't think the burdens that you're talking about are. It doesn't seem to fit. So we're going to be able to ask more questions in writing, and I plan to do that. So thank you. To my friend Commissioner McDowell, in your statement, you stated that the no rate regulation legislation would be improved by clarifying two ambiguities. In your view, could the current language impact the FCC's ability to take action on special access or USF reform?
Well, I think clarity is always good coming from Congress to the FCC. Right. So if you have concerns really on any issue, I think there are probably a whole host of friendly amendments that could help clarify it. So
I think, Mr. Chairman, that's what I was referring to in my opening statement. So I think that's an area that we should work on relative to Mr. Kinzinger's legislation, so that there is real clarity. To Mr. Feld, by the FCC's own data on the Small Business Deployment, Broadband Deployment Act, it represents over 11 million households. Do you think it's premature that these rules will have a deleterious effect on broadband providers without a determination of what the actual burden is on small businesses?
I do think this is premature, and that Congress will definitely benefit from allowing developments to move forward. The FCC is in the middle of its evaluation process. I am sympathetic to the problems and burdens for small business, and this is not the first time the FCC has dealt with the very difficult question of how do you balance the needs of the customers, which include many small businesses, and the needs of the small providers who are clearly not in the same place as a Comcast or an AT&T where they can do these things trivially. Nevertheless, I also would like to point out that oftentimes when there's a change in regime, people are concerned. They have a tendency to look at, oh my God, all of these terrible things are going to happen, to think about worst case scenarios, and ultimately these things work out. And I do think that Congress will have significant opportunity, the FCC will have significant opportunity to recalibrate if things do not work out. But I do think that we need a record before we move forward, particularly in light of the potential unintended consequence to consumers and small businesses.
Thank you very much.
Just for the record, our legislation has nothing in it advocating regime change. We'll now go to Ms. Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McDowell, I want to come to you for just a couple of points. I'm concerned about private sector investment. And as we look at 3.9 billion network devices by the time we get to 2019, which is not my number, not your number, it is a number that the experts give us, and we look at $1 billion in investment that has already taken place by the private sector to handle broadband expansion. And one of the things, those of us that have constituents that live in underserved areas, when it comes to high-speed internet, one of the things we constantly hear is, when is this going to reach us? And we know the fastest path is primarily through private sector investment and the ability to do this. But my concern is, as you look at the private sector investment, the effect that having the FCC's authority to do rate regulation, having that sitting out there undefined, not being corralled, if you will, the effect that that is going to have on that investment. And I would like to know if you all have looked at what you think the decrease in private sector investment will be for expansion and building out these networks if the FCC takes this authority and runs with it.
Thank you for the excellent question. And now that I'm in the private sector, I work a lot and talk a lot with investors and market analysts, both sort of on the venture side and all the way to the secondary market end of the ecosphere. And the record in 2010, in May of 2010, the FCC initiated its Title II proceeding, which then was shelved by Chairman Janikowski for the other Open Internet Order of 2010. But during the course of that, during the comment period, the record was filled by investors and market analysts of all stripes and flavors, small businesses, large businesses, indicating that Title II and rate regulation in particular would squelch investment. What the exact number is hard to tell. And also, we don't have rate regulation yet, but this can be a slow grinding halt. It's not like one day it just falls off of a cliff, but the reduction in investment over time can slow down considerably. So you'd see just a slow decay or sort of a hardening of the arteries, if you will, in the lightning-fast internet space, and that would be a shame. So it's in, potentially in the tens of billions of dollars, but every analyst I talk to every week asks me about what the future potential of rate regulation is on broadband, and they're very concerned about it.
Well, conversely, then, let's look at if you provide certainty to the space and the FCC is prohibited from moving forward with rate regulation, what do you think the increase would be? Is it exponential? Is it unlimited?
I think let's, again, let history be our guide. If you look at the investment, the hundreds of billions in infrastructure investment since just the mid-'90s, I think you'd see that sort of growth line continue. I think without some sort of assurance, or if there's actually the sort of Damocles hanging over these investors, it'll slow down.
Okay, let me quickly go to the Small Business Deployment Act. I'm concerned about that, and I know these temporary extensions are good, but you know, we need something that's going to make it permanent. And I think of some of my smaller providers like Ritter Communications, which serves some of West Tennessee and is one of the small disclosures. What can they expect if the exemption is not made permanent? And how will these disclosure requirements affect their ability to serve some of these rural and underserved areas which are just clamoring? They need this. They need access to broadband for economic development, for enhanced educational opportunities. So tell me what Ritter and other small providers would expect.
Is that for Ms. Bowles?
It's for you.
For me. So, and I think she's actually going to give you an even better answer. But, the notion that more regulation is going to help smaller providers deploy and serve customers in hard-to-reach areas sort of turns all the logic on its head, right? So I'll let Ms. Bowles elaborate on that.
Okay, that's good. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, right now, companies like Ritter and like Aristotle are moving into rural areas and deploying and bringing much-needed service into the very areas that you're talking about, and regulation will slow that down. It isn't going to augment that in any way. Even taking some of the numbers that Congresswoman Eshoo put out there and saying that they're accurate, 24 hours is a lot of time in a company. Like there's one in Colorado run by a man named Eden Ricoeur, and he is the only employee of that company. He recently hired a second employee. It's his daughter. That man doesn't have 24 hours. If a tower goes down, he has to go out there. He doesn't have 24 hours in a year to be dealing with this regulation. And that's assuming it can all be done in-house. We don't mind dealing with customer complaints. We don't want to pay attorneys to have to deal with this regulation. That takes away from our ability to deploy into the same rural areas that we all agree are in desperate need of this service. We're in Arkansas. You don't have to go very far outside of Little Rock, and they have literally nothing. And this regulation and the fact that I have to be concerned about spending 80 hours a year on an attorney, even that is expensive for a business of my size. We're not talking about businesses with hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue. We're talking about very small businesses with one employee and under 1,000 customers.
Okay, yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome to our panelists and Commissioner McDowell. It's good to see you again. Mr. Feld, I've been fighting for a long time for reforms to the competitive market for business-to-business high-capacity data lines, or what we call special access. This market is rife with allegations of price gouging, predatory terms and conditions, and anti-competitive behavior by incumbent telecommunications companies. And I'm glad to see the FCC acting to make the much-needed reforms to these markets. Tell me, what effect do you think the rate regulation bill before us will have on the FCC's ability to complete its special access proceedings?
Well, as written, I believe it will bring everything to a crashing halt. It's important to recognize that a legal argument does not have to ultimately prevail to prevent the FCC from moving forward on important competitive policies and consumer protections. Some years back, we were involved in the bill shock proceeding where, as members know, they were receiving letters from constituents that their folks were receiving bills for $5,000 because their phone got turned on in Canada. And when the FCC went to take action, they ran into the concern about their authority that what's called the common carrier prohibition would prevent them from applying basic consumer protections, basic a requirement to send an alert that you're about to generate an overcharge would be preempted by the common carrier prohibition because broadband at that time was a Title I service. It is very easy to see how in the special access proceeding, which has been going on for more than 10 years, where the GAO has twice reported that the FCC needs to take action, and where we are finally, after a mound of evidence has been collected, a framework established, we are on the verge of being able to put this thing to bed and get it done and stop monopoly pricing. Now, a new broadly worded, sweeping law will be introduced which will bring everything to a halt and may force the process to be discontinued altogether.
Let me ask you also, a number of ISPs have announced plans to institute zero rating policies. These plans allow ISPs to designate certain types of Internet traffic as not counting against the consumer's data cap. I'm very concerned that some of these plans involve ISPs zero rating their own services, particularly video services that compete against over-the-top services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, iTunes, forcing consumers to use their own data with a competing service while zero rating their own, the zero rating their own services seems blatantly anti-competitive to me. And additionally, there's reports that ISPs are establishing paid zero rating agreements where edge providers have to pay the ISP to get their data zero rated. Most worrisome is reports that companies are using the guise of zero rating to throttle entire classes of content without even notifying their customers. Aggressive zero rating policies paired with restrictive data caps threaten the very core of the open internet and the dynamic ecosystem of the competitive services we've all come to enjoy. What effect do you think this rate regulation bill before us will have on the FCC's ability to police this type of behavior?
Well, I am very concerned about that. It would seem that, as Commissioner McDowell said, he'd like to actually have this clarified to make sure that it would absolutely prevent the FCC from going after even basic fraud. There are 12,000 complaints at the FCC already about Comcast having inaccurate broadband data meters. So that even if we accept that it's okay for them to charge, to not count their own product stream, as opposed to counting everybody else's streaming product like Amazon or Netflix, even if we were to accept that as okay and not anti-competitive, which raises particular concerns, we have thousands of customers complaining that the broadband meters that they use are inaccurate, that Comcast does not adequately explain the charges or where they come from, and I think everyone on this committee has read the joys of trying to work your way through the Comcast complaint system to have these charges explained and potentially reversed. It is, even from a basic consumer protection standpoint, very troubling to have such a sweeping, broadly worded law injected into this process. And when we look at defending the core net neutrality principles, which everybody has said there is broad consensus on from many Republicans as well as from Democrats, I would say that Ms. Matsui is absolutely correct, that it becomes effectively impossible for the FCC to enforce its core net neutrality principles, which are exceedingly popular and on which there is widespread consensus, because any of them can be interpreted as either directly or directly regulating the rate at which broadband services are offered.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
You're more than welcome. And we'll now turn to the Vice Chair of the subcommittee, very capable Mr. Latta.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I can be more complimentary now.
That's
Ohio and Oregon aren't playing the
That's
national
right.
championship.
But again, thanks for holding today's hearing. Again, thanks for our panel for very good testimony today. Ms. Bowles, if I could start with you, I'd like to kind of combine a couple of questions right off the bat, because I think that we all have a lot of our districts look very similar to one another. And last year I was contacted by a company in my district called Amplex, which serves about 5,500 customers. Pardon me. And they made me aware of their concerns about losing the exemption to enhance transparency rules for smaller providers, because if the exemption were to expire, they would incur additional legal costs, which you've been really explaining here and what would do, and networking monitoring costs that they simply could not afford. In your testimony, you also recognize how making the transparency exemption for small ISPs permanent keeps resources where they should be, expanding the company, hiring more employees, upgrading the network, and providing better service to rural and underserved Americans. Two questions, and I'm going to also have you maybe back up to what the gentle lady, the ranking member, had asked to Mr. McDowell. First, why do you think the FCC ignored hundreds of comments and letters to make the exemption permanent and only extended it by 1 year? And if you'd also like to elaborate a little bit on the ranking member's question to Mr. McDowell.
I think that the FCC has some discomfort, and I obviously am not in their mind, and so I don't know what their thinking is. The record was extremely one-sided. There's not anything in the record that indicates that small businesses are the bad actors. There's not a single idea in the record that the small businesses are the ones that are engaging in these predatory practices. Companies like mine don't have the market power to influence in the way of a company like Comcast. And so I believe that the FCC hasn't done its homework. I go back to what Commissioner McDowell said. It didn't do its homework. It got its cart before the horse. I think that's a very good way of putting it. It wanted to get this out there as quickly as it could, and it essentially punted on the issue of the small business exemption.
Yeah, but why would they want to get it out there that quickly then? If they didn't do their homework, why do you think they wanted to get it out there so quickly?
I think they wanted to get the open internet order out, and when we had our meetings with the FCC prior to that order, and we were saying, you have not looked under the Paperwork Reduction Act, you haven't looked at the impact on small businesses, I think they realized that they hadn't. And so they put in the exemption so that they could get the order out and like punt that down the road and deal with it later. And then at the very last minute, on the last day when that order was set to expire, they punted it for another year. I think they're trying to figure out a way. I don't know what they're trying to get to. I don't know whether they're trying to find a compromise. I don't know if they don't like the 100,000 number that they were using and if they should be using the SBA definition. I don't know where they're coming from on that front, but I do know that there was no justification in the record for making the exemption temporary. The exemption should have been made permanent. It should have been made permanent in December. There was absolutely nothing to support a temporary. Let's extend this again and create more regulatory uncertainty for another year. And that's really the problem. The problem is we don't know what to expect. Nobody knows what the regulation is going to be at the end of the day, and it's very difficult to assess how we're supposed to respond to something when we don't actually know what it's going to come out at the very end. We live in these communities. We work in these communities. We support these communities, and we want to bring broadband into the communities in which we live. We are very, very small businesses, and I can't emphasize that enough. Even $10,000 Amplex. I know the owner of Amplex, and he has a very robust business, but it's small by any measure, by any definition. His business is small. And having to come up with even $10,000, $15,000 for regulatory counsel is a huge amount of money for a company of that size. So I don't feel that it's an exaggeration to say that it's impacting our businesses very severely, even to get the legal advice necessary to understand what we're supposed to do to deal with this. And we would like certainty. We encourage Congress to give us that certainty. And I think that the appropriate thing in light of the record, in light of the fact that we're not the bad actors, that is to make this exemption permanent.
Thank you. Mr. Feld, if I could ask my remaining about 30 seconds here, and you testified about the rural broadband subscribers who are in need of protection from fraud or fly-by-night providers. Could you describe some of the business models of a fly-by-night rural broadband provider?
Certainly, and I need to emphasize that we have a long history that wherever we establish a permanent exemption, exempting an entire class of businesses, bad actors move in. And as a consequence, it is not a question of the providers that we have today in the market that troubles me. I've worked with WISPA and with Ms. Bowles on a number of spectrum issues, and I am, in fact, very supportive of their efforts to bring broadband to rural America, and I'm happy to testify to that when we have a spectrum hearing. But I do worry that once we put out a sign out there that says this is a great place to go if you want to set up a scam operation because you can't be held accountable, that people will take advantage of that. In particular, I worry about a failure to disclose about network management practices where extra charges would be put in. If I were a bad actor looking to scam small businesses, I'd offer them, great introductory rates. I'd offer, and then
my time's running out. If I could just ask real quickly, could you point us to one of those actors, like an example?
As in an example in the real world today?
Right. One of those type of nefarious type operators?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure that I understand the question, specifically with regard to the FCC's transparency rules?
If you have the evidence to those type of operators and can point us to one of those type of operators.
Well, the FCC continues to receive complaints on a regular basis. Most of them, it is true, concern the larger operators, which is not surprising because they have the larger number of customers. With regard to small businesses, I'm happy to
follow up to the committee with some written examples. We'd appreciate that.
Certainly.
We now need to turn to the gentlelady from New York, Ms. Clark.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I thank our ranking member for holding this hearing. To the panelists, thank you for lending your expertise to the examination of today's legislation. Mr. Feld, the transparency rule has been an important staple of the FCC's net neutrality rules for some time. As they say, knowledge is power. Could you briefly explain what the transparency rule and its enhancements seek to accomplish and why it may be so important?
Certainly. The transparency rule, and there's been broad bipartisan consensus about the value of transparency, seeks to provide to subscribers a clear understanding of how the provider will manage the network, what the capacities of the network is, from a business perspective, whether the network is actually up to the task that you need to hire it for. This encourages market competition, protects consumers, businesses, and innovators. We have a broad policy in this country of encouraging telecommuting, of moving, increasing traffic to broadband. And if I'm a small business operator, an architect, for example, that uses very heavy data-intense files, gigabits of data, which is not necessarily the same as the needs of another small business, I need to know if the broadband provider I'm choosing can handle the kind of business that I'm running. I'm a private subscriber, but I spend a lot of time doing high bandwidth things, following hearings in Congress, for example, but also talking to my mother in Boston with Parkinson's. And those sorts of things take a lot of bandwidth. I need to know when I'm choosing, since I'm lucky enough to be in an area with choice, which providers are going to impose limits on things like my video calls and my streaming, and how they will manage these things when there is congestion.
And I understand there's a difference between the small business definition that the FCC uses for transparency exemption compared with the definition in the discussion draft. Can you briefly explain the difference and the impact it has?
Certainly. One of the things that's important to recognize is the SBA, and for many years the FCC and other agencies that deal with specific industries, do not employ a single definition for what constitutes a small business. SBA and the FCC have always looked to the particular sectors of the telecommunications market. So a small business from a television perspective means something different from a small business from a cable perspective, from a wireless provider, and so on, including broadband providers. We have in the broadband industry a huge disparity between the large cable providers and the large telephone providers and wireless companies, which have millions of customers and where they are able to achieve economies of scale, and very small providers who do not have the economies of scale, who have different costs and expenses, for whom relief may be appropriate. So the FCC, in using its general definition, crafts a definition, and SBA similarly crafts a definition suitable to the broadband industry specifically. In this case, we are talking about an expansion of, I'm given to understand, about 85% over and above the current SBC exception. These are businesses that have been subject to the transparency requirements for 6 months, and there is no evidence that these businesses are suffering any of the concerns that Ms. Bowles has suggested, afflict smaller companies. And as a consequence, we would look at doubling the number of Americans who lose the benefits of transparency and include companies that, by the standard definitions in the industry, would be considered to be mid-sized carriers rather than small carriers.
Thank you. Ms. Bowles, your testimony, you noted several times the enhancements to the transparency rule would place an inordinate burden on your members. Could you explain precisely what this burden would be for your members?
The enhanced transparency requires additional disclosures which have to meet certain standards that have been set by the FCC. Those standards are vague. It's not clear what it is exactly that we're supposed to be doing. And a lot of the FCC's determinations are going to be made sort of after the fact or through litigation and in the courts. What determines, this is more to do rate regulation, but what determines reasonable rates is not defined. So as soon as what includes sufficient transparency or adequate transparency, that's all got to be litigated through the courts or done through rule making through the FCC. We don't really know. So we're taking our best guess at what we're supposed to be doing. And we may do our absolute best effort to find out 6 months later that it wasn't what the FCC had in mind or it isn't sufficient. We may end up in litigation. We are subject to frivolous complaints potentially from customers who feel that they haven't been disclosed properly. And we don't have enough guidance to know what it is that we're supposed to be doing. So we're looking to regulatory counsel to give us that guidance, but they don't know either because the guidance is not coming out of the FCC and it's not coming out of anywhere else. And so until this is settled and we understand what it is, we have to have some better guidance. And just to speak personally for my business, we do believe in an open internet. We do disclose our policies to our customers. I have no idea whether that disclosure is sufficient under these enhanced disclosure requirements. And I have no way to find that out other than to hire an attorney to give me an opinion as to whether our disclosures are sufficient. And it's expensive.
Gentlelady's time's expired. We'll turn to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Lance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have from the CTIA, the Wireless Association, fine information regarding the blocking of robocalls, apps that might be utilized, and I ask unanimous consent to place that information in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner McDowell, you say that the order does not proscribe ex post facto rate regulations. Could you describe an example in which the FCC might engage in ex post facto rate regulation, and what would it look like?
So hypothetically, what we're talking about there is if whether it's at the interconnection points or for end users or whatever, it could be at any point in the network. Someone brings a complaint to the FCC. They say, look, they're giving us access or whatever, but we think the rate's too high. And the commission will say, well, look, we're not going to engage in rate regulation, but you're right. That rate's too high. So through an enforcement proceeding, it would be essentially a rulemaking, and that's essentially the implementation of what we call a price cap regime. This is not rate of return. It's sort of a de facto price cap. So that then creates more uncertainty to the market. Well, what is too high? What's just right? You know, what's the Goldilocks price here?
Thank you. And in your response to the claim that the bill prohibiting rate regulation could result in prolonged litigation uncertainty, from my perspective, doesn't current ambiguity and overly broad rules also lead to the fact that there might be litigation?
Sure. I mean, it's important to note that just sections 201 and 202 of the 1934 Act have been litigated about 400 times in the appellate courts and over 1,000 times within the FCC administrative regulation. And that's just two sections of Title II, both of which, by the way, deal with rate regulation. So I think we can expect that in the future should there be rate regulation, even if it's sort of this de facto ex post type regulation.
Thank you. Would anybody else on the panel like to comment? Mr. Feld, yes.
Thank you. I do wish to stress a couple of points. One is what concerns me is when Congress took this approach in 1984 with regard to cable, and in the 1984 Cable Act preempted all forms of rate regulation, including the kinds described by Commissioner McDowell, it turned out to be a disaster. The price of basic cable service escalated. Cable operators were quick to take advantage of their incumbency and engage in broad anti-competitive action. By contrast, the Title II, Section 201, which is what we're talking about here, is the period where Commissioner McDowell agrees that investment in telecommunications under the 1996 Act flourished. Those are the conditions under which the wireless industry flourished. And when those industries have begun to consolidate and begin to overcharge consumers, it is the ability of the FCC to come in and act which has helped to restrain them. If the prices are genuinely monopoly rate prices, and therefore people come to the FCC saying they're too high, I would hope that the FCC would act to constrain genuine monopoly rate prices. I think that additionally, as Commissioner McDowell noted earlier, this is not going to happen overnight in terms of impacts. When we're talking about these things, it will be, potentially, if there are problems, it will be a gradual process that emerges. I think the Congress will benefit enormously from seeing how this develops, allowing the FCC to resolve the existing uncertainty rather than perpetuating uncertainty by passing laws before we know what the final effect will be.
Mr. McDowell?
If I could just
Mr.
respond.
McDowell?
Thank you very much. So a couple things. First of all, cable rates are not regulated. So the notion that they have been or should be is incorrect. By the way, and also information services, which is what we called these things until last year, broadband internet access, had no transparency requirement before the 2010 Open Internet Order. All right. So as Ms. Bowles has pointed out, the record before the FCC does not contain really even a scintilla of evidence that certainly WISPs or smaller internet service providers are engaging in fraud and deceptive practices and all the rest. And, by the way, one of the problems with the Title II classification is that it took away jurisdiction from the Federal Trade Commission under Section 5 of the Federal Trade Commission Act to protect consumers. That was the cop on the beat that people say is needed. You took a cop off of the beat and sent it to a different agency which doesn't have the same expertise as the Federal Trade Commission does. So we haven't had information services rate regulated. Cable has not been rate regulated for forever. And so the notion that somehow there was this utopia where there was command and control rate regulation, everything was fine, is just not true in this space. The Internet has flourished precisely because it migrated further away from government involvement.
Thank you. My time has expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Let's see. Next up, the gentlelady from Colorado, Ms. DeGette.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the panelists for coming today. I'm sorry I was late, but I actually had my own bill up for hearing in another subcommittee. I did want to ask, as the FCC's net neutrality order continues to be implemented, one of the concerns that we heard is that there's regulatory uncertainty caused by potential Title II regulation. And so I wanted to talk about that a little bit. First of all, Mr. Feld, H.R. 2666 seeks to bar rate regulation under the net neutrality order, and I'm wondering, without clearly defining regulating the rates, would this bill create more or less uncertainty for telecom companies? And being a lawyer, I always ask this question, would it result in additional litigation?
Well, I think that it definitely, when you have broad sweeping language with undefined terms, but where the breadth of the language indicates a congressional intent to prevent even basic consumer protection, such as protection against monopoly rates, this is going to create enormous uncertainty. There is a conflict here in that there is a claim that we're not going after the core Title II protections. We're not going after the core bright line rules that the FCC established. We're only going after rate regulation. But without defining this, we have essentially said, yeah, but anything you do to actually enforce the rules you have could be considered rate regulation. And that is just going to encourage an enormous amount of uncertainty and litigation. I also must respond just a little bit to Commissioner McDowell in saying the sweet spot we have now is exactly the one. It's not command and control tariffing, which everybody agrees is bad. It's not the Wild West, let a handful of companies in a concentrated industry decide what the prices ought to be on critical infrastructure. It's the current sweet spot of just don't rip off consumers and keep things reasonable, okay? Can we just make an honest profit, and not a monopoly profit? And I think the FCC ought to remain in a position to make sure that broadband companies make healthy returns but have to work for a living and satisfy consumer demands to do so.
What do you think about that, Commissioner McDowell? Obviously, you have a view.
There's a lot there, so which that are you
well, in particular, the definition of regulating the rates. Do you think that's going to lead to more litigation?
Rate regulation will lead to more litigation, absolutely, even if it's this.
But I mean, but the fact that it's not so clearly defined in the legislation.
Well, and so I've offered a couple of ideas, general categories of ideas as to how you could define it. I think better. In terms of consumer protection, I think there could be probably friendly amendments offered to where you could find consensus on that. I don't think.
So you actually you share my concern that term might be overbroad in the legislation.
Well, as I put, testimony speaks for itself. There could be some clarity involved there.
Okay, I think it'd be really great if you could work with us on helping to clarify that. If you have some ideas,
be happy to.
We'd love
happy
to hear
work
it.
with the subcommittee.
Now, it's my understanding that the FCC forbore itself from the portions of Title II that it would need in order to set the rates of Internet service providers. So I'm wondering, Commissioner, what would be required for a future FCC commissioner to set the same rate, set the rates for ISPs?
To prohibit a future FCC from doing that?
Right.
Yeah. So I think the seeds for that are definitely in the legislation before you today. So to help prevent that from happening, and again, this could be the bipartisan consensus from President Obama on down.
So you really think that we could work to really hammer out this legislation for more clarity?
I'm very optimistic. Absolutely.
Okay.
I'd love to be an honor for me to work.
You think it needs some work?
Absolutely, as I said in my written testimony.
Thanks. So. I yield back.
Generally yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. And Mr. Feld, I want to ask you a question. You argue that there is no need to grant an exemption for small businesses from the enhanced transparency rules. But in my opinion, the record does not support your contention. The record actually indicates that the burdens imposed by the enhanced transparency rules could require hundreds of hours of compliance work by small ISPs like Mrs. Bowles, who can ill afford to spend that money on anything that does not improve underlying ISP service. There are very few arguments that the rules are necessary for small businesses. One argument that you make is that the transparency requirements are necessary to catch the, quote, your quote, fly-by-night actors and scammers. But isn't that more like using a sledgehammer to swat a fly? And the question I have really is, why should all small business operators be saddled with onerous and costly transparency requirements so that we can catch a few bad actors?
I'm sorry if I am unclear. What I believe I said, and what I certainly mean, is not that we should not have a set of rules that are sensitive to the needs of small carriers. I am not even opposed to the FCC deciding that at this time we could make the exemption permanent. What I worry about is Congress's preemptive effect. And when Congress passes a law, as Ranking Member Eshoo said, that's a big deal because it makes it impossible for the agency to respond to changing circumstances. As we move forward, and things settle, we may need to revisit this. We may find that we see the emergence of scams. That's been, as I've said, a long history, that wherever we've set up a permanent congressional exemption to oversight or accountability, that bad actors move in because they can. So, again, I'm not against a permanent exemption on a complete record. I simply believe the moment now is premature. The FCC is in the process of evaluating the record, and I believe their process is correct. I know there's been some suggestion that the cart was before the horse, but I would suggest that the FCC determined that the enhanced transparency was in the public interest. That
Thanks.
they had
I
enough
appreciate
evidence.
you clarifying that. But it gets to a fundamental question, and I think throughout this city and throughout this probably history written about this era in government is I think Congress has, in the past, I think some of this to Congress's own fault, been very differential to the administration, and not just here. I'm talking in everything that we're talking about here, and why I was just in a meeting beforehand in the labor area. And in doing so, it allows the vagueness we need. It's too hard to get things changed. Let's make it open. Let's make it where the administration can administer. Why should Congress put something that's too hard to get it undone if it needs to be undone? And I would argue in EPA and I just labor meeting, whatever, then what happens if the administration doesn't do the intent of Congress? And I would certainly say they are. So that's, I think it's our responsibility to clarify. But I appreciate your position. I think it's our responsibility to make sure if it's something we think is in the good interest that it is congressionally enforced and mandated. And Ms. Bowles, you said the FCC earlier, the FCC punted on making the small business exemption permanent. Do you think they failed to act when they should have?
That they failed to make it permanent when they should have, yes.
You think that it would be? Because the question also that I hear, and it's kind of not just in this world, but it's in the entire government world. Everywhere I go, and you're a small business person, in my district, my family has a small business, medium-sized business. So everywhere I go, it's not just what the rules and regulations are. It's just that they're not, people don't know what they're going to be from day to day or month to month. Had a bill out of this full committee and another subcommittee on the health care bill for small businesses. And even the witness against the bill said exactly what was just said. It said, I believe we should do this, but let's not make it permanent. Let's do a waiver for a year to see if this works or not work. And that's what I said. The entire, throughout government, and people trying to implement business, grow business, hire people, put them to work, or just, there's so much uncertainty. That is a common word I hear if you go into a restaurant, a manufacturing business, or in a high-tech business, so that you're in. So what does the of these reporting requirements prevent you or help? I'll let you say, I'm not going to prejudice the question. How does it help or hurt you in what you want to do as a business person?
Well, I want to reiterate that our members are small. The average WISP has 1,500 to 2,000 customers. They're small businesses with very few employees, usually less than a handful of employees that are doing this. They live in the communities they serve. They're working next to their neighbors. They live in the real world, and they're dealing with real world problems. And so what the regulatory uncertainty does is it distracts them from dealing with the real world that they're in and getting broadband service to their neighbors with this thing that is not necessary, based on the record, that causes them to turn their attention away from expanding their networks and getting broadband into rural America. Rural America can least afford additional regulatory expense, and that is what essentially is happening. The 3,000 small ISPs are serving the areas in this country that the larger providers cannot financially justify going into. We're able to do it because the barriers to entry are so low, because the cost for our members coming in to serve it are low enough that we can justify it. If those costs go up, then that justification changes.
Well,
there are
thanks.
communities.
I know I understand my time's expired. Appreciate the answer. Mr. Feld, I appreciate you for clarifying as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. McNerney, 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. I think the witnesses this morning. Mrs. Bowles, looking at the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act, one of the contentious issues is how to define a small business. If you look at the earlier definition of 100,000 subscribers, that sounds like a lot to me. I mean, if each subscriber is $100 a month, and you have 100,000 subscriber, that's $10 million a month, $120 million a year. That's not a small business in my mind. So how could you define a small business? What would be the measure of a small business in your mind?
Honestly, I have to defer to the experts in the United States government who define that. I understand that there are a lot of different definitions for small business, and the 100,000 number or the SBA's use of a 500,000 subscriber number, as I said, the majority of our members are significantly smaller than that.
Right.
That would fit under any definition of small business. So from our perspective, the important thing is whatever number you end up with, it needs to embrace the smallest of the small businesses so that they're protected, so that they can continue to grow their business and continue to serve rural America.
So, I mean, is the number of subscribers a good metric to define?
It's an adequate metric. I mean, it's a proxy for revenue, so I suppose it's fine. But number of employees is also significant, because if you have only 5 employees, even if you have 10,000 subscribers, it would be a very substantial burden for a company of that size. So I think you need to look both at how many employees you have as well as your revenue or the number of subscribers that you have. I don't think it's a singular number necessarily.
Commissioner McDowell, would you want to weigh on this? How would you?
I think it's a healthy discussion to have. Exactly how are you defining small business? Is it on a subscriber basis, an employee basis, a revenue basis? Although employees and subscribers, I think, capture a lot. I think the point that Ms. Bowles, though, is making is that the vast majority, in fact, if not 99.99% of their members, of WISPA's members, are mom and pop organizations, quite literally, or dad and daughter, as you pointed out, organizations.
Right.
And so
I mean, 100,000 subscribers seems like a modest.
If you're a WISP and you have 100,000 subscribers, roughly how many employees would you have?
Oh, wow. You'd have to have several hundred employees to have 100,000 subscribers. You'd have to have several hundred employees.
But that could still fit within a small business.
That could still fit within a small business, and it is correct. 99.98% of our members fit underneath the small business definition provided by the FCC.
So, I mean, it sounds like moving from 100,000 to 500,000 subscribers is a bit of an overreach. Mr. Feld, my next question has to do with the Universal Service Fund. I think in your testimony, you indicated that the 2666 might impede that development. What's your feeling on that?
Well, I have a lot of concerns. The USF reform has been very complicated. Part of it is based on a core provision of the statute, Section 254, which directs that services should not cost substantially more in rural areas than comparable services in urban areas. So if the core purpose of the statute, particularly for the Rural High Cost Fund, is to regulate rates and make them more affordable for people, and you have a law that says absolutely no, under any law can you do anything that regulates rates, then I don't see how you avoid the problem of, well, the purpose of the whole law is to make the broadband affordable. That's rate regulation, indirectly through a subsidy, but still rate regulation. The additional problems are that one of the goals in high cost in particular has been to end the system of implicit subsidies, inter-carrier compensation, and termination fees, and shift to a more straightforward explicit compensation through the high cost fund. That was in order to balance these things out without raising the rate on the ratepayers, done by price regulation. So, and that was challenged and affirmed in the 10th Circuit, but this would give those folks who lost a fairly lengthy and contentious litigation a second bite at the apple, and I don't see how the FCC doesn't just throw up its hands and put everything on hold or abandon the operation altogether.
Okay, I'm going to let the Commissioner answer, but please keep it brief.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I know we're short on time. First of all, I think it'll give both of you some comfort that in October of 2011, 3 Democrats and 1 Republican, we got together for the first time in history and incorporated some reforms for universal service to extend those subsidies to broadband services when they were deemed an information service prior to the Title II order of last year. Okay, so it was the unanimous consensus of the commissioners and of the staff at the FCC that you did not have to have broadband classified as common carriage and therefore subject to rate regulation, which is where I'm going with that. So that's number one, and that was litigated before the 10th Circuit and upheld. So that was challenged and upheld by the courts. So I don't think there's going to be an issue here at all. But if there is an issue, then the other comfort I'd like to offer is that perhaps there could be a friendly amendment to that regard saying universal service is a carve-out.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for the suggestion. Mr.
Yes.
Gilbeck.
Chair recognizes Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Chairman, and thanks to the folks here, and thank you for holding this hearing to the committee. I want to just talk about a couple of bills I introduced, 2666 and 1301. The Amateur Parody Radio Act has over 100 bipartisan co-sponsors, including the chairman. And as a point of interest, every member of Congress throughout the country has at least a few hundred licensed amateur radio operators in their district. Under current law and regulation in certain areas, ham radios are outright prohibited from placing any form of antenna on their home, even those as small as a 4-millimeter diameter wire that would run under an awning or flat against a house. For some, this is merely a nuisance, but for others, those that go through additional training and certification to become an emergency communications volunteer, this can be dangerous. During the times of emergency, like a hurricane or a tornado, amateur radio operators are able to use their skills and equipment to create a network of communications for first responders when all other networks have failed. And as a point of interest, as a military pilot, there were a number of times overseas where we would actually use phone patches and pass coded messages through ham radio operators to our command post. And so I think that's very interesting to note that they serve that purpose too. And a quick summary from the FEMA director, Mr. Fugate, I guess, I don't know if I said his name right, on the issue. He said, quote, "I think that there's a tendency to believe that we have done so much to build infrastructure and resiliency in all of our other systems. When everything else fails, amateur radio oftentimes is our last line of defense. When you need amateur radio, you really need them." And I think this is very important. H.R. 1301 would change some of these issues by implementing a reasonable accommodation standard. There's no mandate on the placement, size, aesthetics, as those decisions are left to the discussion to take place between ham radio operators and their jurisdictions. We just simply add the same standard that's been used successfully in municipal areas to other areas. Switching gears, the rate regulation bill comes about as a result of comments and statements made by the President and by Chairman Wheeler. Following those statements, Chairman Wheeler and I had a conversation in this subcommittee where I asked him the question of, would you support legislation that simply said, notwithstanding any provision of law, the Federal Communications Commission may not regulate the rates charged for broadband internet access service. Very simple. And the chairman agreed, and so we have this bill before us today. Simply put, the government should not be in the business of regulating the rates of private industry. And that's a lesson that we learn when we look at failed governments of the 1980s in the past in terms of regulating private industry. Chairman Wheeler has stated that he will not go down the path of rate regulation, and I give him credit for that, rightfully so, but the power is still there for any future chairman. In listening to the debate today, some legitimate concerns have been raised, and I would offer that if it takes some small changes to address those concerns, I'm more than happy to sit down with any interested parties. We want to do this in a bipartisan way. But I think that's important that we have this conversation, and I appreciate you being here. Mr. McDowell, you bring up the risk of not only this FCC regulating broadband access rates, but a future commission as well. And I know you've served under different administrations. Can you elaborate how that is a concern for you?
Absolutely. Statutory interpretations can change based on the political philosophy and ideology of whoever's chair and who constitutes a majority of the commission. So 8 years ago, for instance, Section 706 was never contemplated as giving the FCC some sort of secret expansive power over the internet space, but that came out of the 2010 order and then was blessed by two judges on the D.C. Circuit. So that changed dramatically, just the interpretation of Section 706, which at the time of the 1996 Act was considered deregulatory, not more regulatory. So you want to make sure that what the interpretation by an FCC is today remains the same. You want to codify that, enshrine that in the statute. That's the only way to really have certainty for the long run.
Yeah, and I know, we're involved in this committee in terms of process reform for the FCC, which I think is necessary in opening, up a lot of the process. But I think what's important to note is that big decisions like this, without this codified, can be made by a few people that make the decision at the moment. And it is the jurisdiction of this committee and this Congress to regulate things like interstate commerce. And when we say we don't want broadband regulated by the government, I think we have a rightful position to have that debate, have that argument, and to get this done. And frankly, again, I would just reiterate, my position is very bipartisan because the chairman of the FCC agreed with me. The president agrees with me. So at this moment of bipartisanship in this committee, we may as well codify that into law. So with that, I want to say thank you to you all and yield back.
Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his questions. The chair recognizes Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the panel for being with us today. Ms. Bowles,
Can you point to any specific flaws in the FCC's analysis when the agency attempted to determine how much the enhanced transparency requirements would cost small businesses? How did the agency fail to account for the specific needs of small businesses? Can you comment on that?
Yes. The FCC drew its conclusion from having made an assumption that because the business is smaller, the regulatory burden would be smaller, and that's almost exactly backwards from the reality. Because a smaller business doesn't have the armies of lawyers, it doesn't have the teams that are already meeting regulatory burdens that many of the people who are affected by open internet already have in place. So the small ISPs weren't in the record, there wasn't an analysis done of the actual cost, the actual monetary cost, or the impact on the networks, or the impacts on expansion. And I've said this before, but we have very, very small WISPs for whom this could literally put them out of business. They have one employee. So it's very hard to, I don't think the FCC really did any analysis of that side of the equation. They just came off.
And it's your assessment that that impact on small business would be significant?
Yes.
Okay. Mr. Feld's testimony discusses significant unintended consequences of the Small Business Broadband Deployment Act, including customers turning instead to national providers. As a representative of the small business community, would you like to respond to that?
I don't think that's a realistic concern.
Okay, and it's
we
not...
compete in an open marketplace right now with larger providers. My company serves rural communities, but we also compete in Little Rock, Arkansas. We compete directly with AT&T and Comcast and larger providers. Right. And we compete on service, we compete on locality, and we compete on price. Okay. And in the rural communities we serve, these are our neighbors and our friends, and we compete again on service and on price, and it is a competitive marketplace. It doesn't concern us at all.
Okay, all right. Finally, Ms. Bowles, was there overwhelming support for making the small business exemption permanent?
Yes. Okay. To my knowledge, there were no comments opposing until the very last moment and before the closing of the comment period.
Yeah, I want to get into that. Mr. Feld, based on the FCC's order, it appears that Public Knowledge did not file comments in response to the Bureau's public notice on this issue. In fact, it appears that the only party to disagree with the extension at all in the proceeding was Free Press, doing so not in comments, but in an ex parte submission made the Friday before the order was released. That's 97 days after the close of the comment period. So is it correct that Public Knowledge did not file?
We believe the extension for the FCC to complete its work was justified.
No, that's not the question.
You are correct. We did not file.
That's not the question. You did not file.
That is correct.
Okay, I yield back. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his questions, and as we bring this hearing to a conclusion, I will recognize myself for a couple of minutes here as we wind down. And so, Mr. Feld, I am a little bit confused or concerned about Public Knowledge not being supportive of H.R. 2666, which is the note rate regulation. So I want to make sure if we're on the same page here in saying I think, and hopefully you would agree, that the President was clear in saying that the FCC should forbear from rate regulation. I mean, you would agree with this, I'm assuming?
Yes, from standard rate regulation.
And then we have Chairman Wheeler also saying time and again that they will forbear, and he believes in forbearing, no rate regulation, no filing tariffs. Again,
having once upon a time and long ago done tariffing and rate regulation through that fashion, I would not wish it on anyone.
So, with both the President and the Chairman saying this, I am a little confused by why Public Knowledge wouldn't support H.R. 2666.
Well, as we've heard, there are a number of interpretations of what the broad sweeping language of H.R. 2666 would mean. I certainly don't think of preventing monopoly providers from charging monopoly prices as being rate regulation. On the other hand, we have heard views expressed that even that kind of ex-ante enforcement of traditional consumer protection should be considered rate regulation under this statute. So while I think that there is agreement on a very broad principle, nobody wants to go back to the old days when we were all, quibbling about whether what went into the rate base and concerned about the ability to raise prices through rate regulation in the fashion that Commissioner McDowell described earlier. I think that we do have a great deal of concern that where providers are charging fraudulent prices, billing in ways that are designed to confuse consumers, what I like to refer to as the nickel and diming of the American people, which it is the FCC's job to stop. I am greatly concerned that the statute as written, given its broad sweeping language, would have that effect.
Well, I can appreciate your interpretation, perhaps, but I like to think forbearance is forbearance, and the rate regulation piece was the key sticking point with a lot of Republicans on this, and we were always comfortable, the President saying he would forbear on the rate side, as did Chairman Wheeler. And since we're a year from now, we'll have both a new President and at some point probably a new Chairman. I think at some point this Congress could codify where we stand on that. So I want to thank the witnesses for their testimony, and the ranking member has certainly indicated I think we have a context we can all work with here. That's what the hearing is all about. Your input has been very valuable. And as we move forward in the next month or so into a markup, we will take your testimony into account, and I want to thank you for that. And also encourage you, for the members that asked for some follow-up, if you could provide that in a timely manner, that would be appreciated. So I'd remind all members they have 10 business days to submit questions. For the record, I ask the witnesses to respond accordingly. And without objection, the committee is adjourned.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good.
Good
Thanks.
job, Chris.
Thank you very much. It's always fun.
Tired.
It's always fun to go from last week to the first. Maybe 20.